There is something different about October in small American towns. The air doesn't just cool, it slows. It gathers itself as if the season knows it's nearing the edge of something sacred. Dryden, New York, was one of those towns, a place where streets curled gently under trees that turned gold before surrendering to rust. People waved at each other from porches. The air smelled of applewood and damp leaves. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, or thought they did. But in 1989, Halloween came to Dryden carrying a silence that would never quite leave. The Harris family lived at the corner of Ellis Hollow Road, in a pale yellow house with white shutters and a porch swing that creaked softly even when the wind stood still. Warren Harris was a local football coach. His wife Dolores taught piano lessons in the front room, and their two daughters, Shelby and Monica, were the kind of bright-eyed, giggling children that made neighbors smile. On October 30th, they were carving pumpkins. Warren had gone to pick up candles. The girls had lined the windowsills with little paper ghosts. Everything about that night felt safe, ordinary, wrapped in the warmth of routine. But safety has its own illusion. Sometimes, just before the dark changes shape, we never notice the quiet turning colder. By the next morning, the town awoke to something unimaginable. A passing jogger saw smoke curling above the Harris home, thin and gray, rising against the early light. By the time help arrived, it was too late. The house was quiet. Inside, investigators found signs that told a story no one wanted to believe. The marks of intrusion, the cruel precision of intent, and the eerie stillness that only tragedy can leave behind. People stopped driving down Ellis Hollow Road. Children were pulled closer when dusk came too soon. And for years after, that corner was known not by the family's name, but by what they lost. As night deepened, Dryden became a town that whispered to itself. Parents kept their lights on longer. Dogs barked at shadows that weren't there. The news crews came and left, but the story stayed, lingering like the smell of rain on scorched wood. The official reports called it a murder. The papers called it a tragedy. But those who lived there, those who had walked those sidewalks, seen the flicker of jack-o'-lanterns in the Harris windows, they called it something else. They called it the hollowing, because that's what it felt like, as though something had been scooped out of the town itself, leaving a space too quiet to fill. Years later, long after the investigation ended, neighbors still spoke of strange things. Not hauntings, not the supernatural kind, but little echoes of what once was. The porch swing still creaked, though the house had been rebuilt. A faint piano melody sometimes drifted from the empty lot before the wind swallowed it. People walking home late on Halloween swore the air grew colder when they passed that corner, like the season itself was remembering. Tragedy, when it settles, doesn't vanish. It changes form. It seeps into walls, into soil, into stories whispered between generations. And Dryden carried that weight, not as a ghost story, but as a lesson about how fragile the idea of home can be. For many, that night marked the end of innocence. Halloween, once a simple gathering of laughter and sugar and light, became something heavier. Children no longer roamed after dark. Porch lights dimmed earlier. The laughter that once filled the crisp air turned cautious, restrained. And yet, amid that hush, life went on. Because that's what small towns do. They keep breathing, even when the air hurts. The new family that moved into the rebuilt home never spoke much. They kept to themselves, tended the garden, painted the porch the same shade of pale yellow. But the locals noticed small things, candles burning long after midnight, faint piano sounds again, and a single pumpkin always placed by the window each Halloween, carved with a gentle smile. No one ever asked them about it. Some things in places like Dryden are better left in peace. And so the hollow street remains what it has always been, quiet, watchful, suspended between memory and myth. To pass by it is to feel something you can't quite name, not fear, but recognition. A reminder that even in the safest corners of the world, darkness can find its way in, softly, like a sigh before sleep. And when the wind rustles the trees there each October, it sounds a little like voices, not crying, not screaming, just remembering. The investigation began the way all small-town tragedies do, with disbelief. Officers who had coached Little League with Warren Harris now stood behind yellow tape, their breath clouding in the cold October air. Reporters came from Syracuse, from Ithaca, from as far as Albany. They spoke of motive, of clues, of what could have driven a person to do this. But for those who lived in Dryden, it wasn't about the who or the why. It was about the how a house filled with music and laughter could, overnight, become a shrine of silence. Neighbors brought flowers. The piano was carried out and covered in a white sheet. For weeks, the scent of ash clung to the grass. The town gathered for a vigil in the high school gym, the same place where Warren had once paced the sidelines, shouting encouragement to his team. When the candles were lit, the air trembled with a soft hum. People sang without quite knowing the words. Dryden tried to move forward, but something inside it had changed. The town's rhythms faltered. Morning coffee at the diner came with longer pauses. Halloween decorations stayed in boxes that year, and as winter came, a strange quiet settled. Not fear exactly, but a kind of listening. As if everyone was waiting for something, a reason, a sign, maybe even forgiveness. What emerged in the months that followed was a pattern. The case wasn't isolated. Another loss followed not long after, in a house just beyond the river, and then another. Each tragedy different in detail, but eerily similar in weight. People began whispering about a curse. A foolish idea, perhaps, but when sorrow repeats itself too precisely, reason starts to sound smaller than belief. Dryden, once known for its safety, began to appear in newspapers under darker headlines. The Village of the Damned, one writer called it, cruel words for a place still mourning its own. But names stick, they echo. And soon Halloween in Dryden became something people avoided rather than anticipated. Children stopped trick-or-treating past Ellis Hollow Road. Porch lights flickered, but few dared knock. The laughter that once danced in the autumn air had been replaced by the low hum of unease. Still, some held on to the past. A teacher at the local school kept a photograph of the Harris family on her desk. "To remember kindness," she'd say. The mailman still left a small candy bar at their old address each October 31st. Traditions, even small ones, have a way of fighting back against the dark. Then came the stories, the ones that blurred truth and comfort. A boy walking his dog claimed he heard a piano playing near the house late one evening. A driver swore he saw a flicker of light in the upstairs window, a candle flame, steady and calm. Another said that, on windless nights, the porch swing still moved, slow and deliberate, as though someone unseen were gently rocking. No one ever proved these things, but maybe they didn't need to. In towns like Dryden, belief fills the spaces where certainty can't reach. Years later, when the tragedy was retold by outsiders, by journalists and documentary crews, the details were sharpened, rearranged, dramatized. But for those who were there, what mattered wasn't the crime itself. It was the silence that followed. It was the way people began speaking in softer tones, as if loudness might disturb something fragile. And in that hush, something else began to take root. A kind of reverence. The old house, repainted and rebuilt, stood quietly, its windows facing west toward the hills. No one spoke of ghosts, and yet no one dismissed the idea entirely either. It became a symbol, both of loss and of resilience. Every Halloween, A few people still pass by and leave something small at the edge of the yard. A candle, a toy, sometimes just a folded note. They do it quietly, with the same respect one gives to a grave. The wind carries away the paper, the rain dims the flame, and still, the gesture remains. What happened in Dryden was real, painfully real, but what lingered was softer, stranger. It wasn't horror exactly. It was the echo of love unfinished, of laughter cut short, a melody that keeps playing even when the song should have ended. And so each October, when the leaves return and the air smells of wood smoke and earth, the people of Dryden remember. They walk slower past that corner, speak the family's names like a prayer, and light one more candle than they need. Because sometimes, remembrance is the only way to make peace with the dark. And as the night deepens, Ellis Hollow Road remains still, the swing quiet, the wind low, and somewhere in that stillness, a feeling like someone finally at rest. Years passed. The world moved on as it always does, but Dryden remained caught between two Octobers, the one before and all the ones after. Seasons came and went, yet the town seemed to hold its breath every time autumn returned. The hills still flamed with color, the maples still shed their gold. But behind that beauty, there was always a pause, a collective remembering. Time has a strange mercy. It doesn't erase pain. It teaches you how to hold it more gently. The people of Dryden began to speak of the Harris family not as victims, but as part of the town's story. A memorial garden was planted near the school, small and quiet, with 3 stone benches beneath a copper beech tree. In spring, the air there smelled of lilac and rain. In October, it filled with drifting leaves that looked under the moonlight like tiny embers floating down from somewhere unseen. Some evenings, an old coach, Warren's former assistant, would sit on one of those benches. He never said much, just sat, hands folded, head slightly bowed. The sound of the wind through the trees was enough. People passing by would nod, not intruding. It was a kind of silent agreement, that remembrance could be private and still shared. The town's children grew up hearing whispers about the Hollow Street. To them, it wasn't fearsome. It was solemn. Parents told them the story in hushed voices, not to scare, but to remind, that even the safest places need care, and that kindness once lost must be rebuilt one small act at a time. By the late 1990s, Halloween began to return. First, just a handful of porch lights glowing again, timidly. Then the sound of footsteps on leaf-strewn sidewalks, children giggling beneath masks and capes. Neighbors stood at their doors, hesitant smiles softening under the flicker of pumpkin candles. The fear didn't vanish. It just learned to coexist with gentleness. One year, the new family in the rebuilt Harris home decided to join. They placed 3 pumpkins on their porch, simple, uncarved, each with a candle inside. Nothing dramatic, just a quiet gesture. But when the trick-or-treaters passed, they slowed down, looked, and for reasons none of them could name, they smiled. It felt like permission. It felt like healing. And that was how the legend softened. Not broken, not erased, but soothed. The story of Dryden became less about horror and more about endurance. The people began to see that what haunted them wasn't the crime. It was the silence they'd allowed to follow. And in breaking that silence, they reclaimed their October. Sometimes, on clear nights, when the moon hung low and gold, the sound of a piano could still be heard drifting faintly across the fields. Maybe it was just the wind through the wires, or maybe not. But those who heard it never seemed afraid. They said it sounded peaceful, like someone finally finishing a song that had been waiting too long. Ellis Hollow Road, once called Cursed, now simply feels still. The houses there look ordinary again, porches with soft lights, curtains half drawn, the smell of firewood curling into the air. If you pass by slowly, you might notice the faint creak of that old swing, moving on its own, steady and unhurried. It doesn't feel ominous. It feels like breathing, like something that refused to vanish because it still had one more memory to hum. There's a kind of holiness in that, the way grief can fade into gentleness, the way remembrance can settle into peace. Dryden never forgot its shadow, but it learned to live beside it. And in that balance, it found something sacred, the courage to love again, even in a world that once took so much away. So if you ever find yourself there, on an October evening when the air smells faintly of apples and wood smoke, pause at the corner of Ellis Hollow Road. Listen, the quiet will speak to you, not in words, but in the hush between them. You might feel the past breathing softly around you, not to frighten, but to remind that even the darkest stories, when told with care, can end in light. And so, as the wind sighs through the leaves and the night folds back into silence, the story of Dryden rests, half tragedy, half lullaby. Its echoes drift through the trees, through the years, through the hearts of those who still light candles by their windows each. Halloween? For not all hauntings are curses. Some are simply love refusing to let go. There is a kind of stillness that only small mining towns know, the hush of places that once thrived on noise, now breathing quietly through the decades. Mineral Point, Wisconsin, is one such town. Its streets are lined with limestone cottages built by Cornish miners nearly 2 centuries ago, each one etched with time's slow patience. By day it feels warm and familiar, handmade, almost fragile. But by night, when the wind slips down from the hills and fog drapes the old quarries, the town takes on another voice, a softer one, older. For as long as anyone could remember, there had been stories, not of monsters or curses, but of a figure, a man in a long gray coat and a white mask. He was said to appear only in October, always near the cemetery at the edge of town. Some said he walked at midnight, others claimed he simply stood among the headstones, motionless, as if listening. Parents told it as a bedtime tale, the kind meant to thrill children before lights out. Behave, or the Mineral Point Phantom will find you. But for most, it was just folklore, a way to explain the feeling that sometimes comes on cold nights when the wind sounds too much like footsteps. Then came Halloween of 1981. Officer John Lang was patrolling the west end of town that night. The streets were quiet. Most trick-or-treaters had already gone home. The air smelled of wet leaves and smoke from distant bonfires. At 11:45 p.m., he turned onto Cemetery Road, a route he'd driven 100 times before, and saw something he would never forget. A man, tall and unnaturally still, standing in the road just ahead. He wore a gray trench coat that brushed against the pavement and a smooth, pale mask, featureless except for 2 dark holes where eyes should be. When the patrol car's headlights touched him, he didn't flinch. He simply turned his head slowly and began to walk toward the cemetery gate. Langa stepped out of his car and called out, his voice steady but cautious. The figure didn't stop. The gravel under its boots made no sound. When Lang moved closer, the man suddenly broke into a run, swift, almost gliding, and disappeared into the mist between the gravestones. Backup arrived within minutes, but they found nothing. No footprints, no signs of struggle, no hint of where he'd gone. Just the fog and the faint sound of a church bell from somewhere in the distance. By morning, the story had already spread. The Mineral Point Phantom was no longer legend. It had become a report filed and signed by a police officer. For weeks, people avoided the cemetery after dark. Children walked faster on their way home, and each night, when the fog settled thick over the town, curtains were drawn early, doors locked tight. But what began as fear soon turned to fascination. Residents came forward with their own accounts, fleeting glimpses of the same figure, always masked, always silent. One couple swore they saw him near the old mine shaft, watching from the ridge as they drove by. Another claimed to have found a single white mask hanging from their fence on Halloween morning, its surface still damp with dew. No one ever saw his face. No one knew where he came from. And yet the more people spoke of him, the more the story changed. Some said he was a ghost, the spirit of a miner lost to the earth, condemned to wander until he found the last piece of silver he'd never unearthed. Others whispered of a hermit who lived in the woods, obsessed with disguises, his mind slowly dissolving into the stories people told about him. But there was something deeper beneath all the folklore, something that made even the skeptics uneasy. The masks. In the autumn of 1982, local shopkeeper Margaret Vale noticed something peculiar. The small costume shop she owned, Vale's Variety, kept losing masks from its shelves, always the same kind, plain white, expressionless, no break-ins, no evidence of theft. They simply vanished. She kept a record of it in her ledger, puzzled but not frightened. It wasn't until Halloween night that she found one of them again, laid neatly at her doorstep, a small stone resting on top of it, as though marking a grave. She sold the shop the next year. The local newspaper printed an editorial titled, "The Man in the Mask, Fear in a Quiet Town." It spoke of how a community's imagination could sometimes make something more real than evidence ever could. But even the writer admitted that when the fog came rolling in and the old cemetery bell tolled 12, he sometimes looked out the window and swore he saw a shadow move among the stones. By then, the legend had already outgrown logic. Children dared each other to walk the cemetery fence line after dark. Teenagers left candles at the gate, calling out to the phantom in laughter that trembled slightly beneath the sound. The adults, meanwhile, just watched from behind closed windows, wondering quietly why the figure felt both terrifying and familiar. Perhaps it wasn't the mask that frightened them most, but the idea that it could belong to anyone. By the following October, Mineral Point had changed. What began as whispers over diner coffee had turned into nightly talk on porches, in grocery aisles, in the spaces between laughter where fear liked to settle. The legend had become a living thing, fed by uncertainty, nurtured by the soft hum of imagination. Children who once feared bedtime now begged to hear the story again, each time slightly altered by whoever told it. The masked man became taller, faster, sometimes floating, sometimes vanishing in the blink of an eye. But for the adults, the story didn't feel like make-believe anymore. Too many had seen too much, and what they saw refused to fit neatly inside reason. One of them was Tom Reeves, a postal worker who often took the early morning route along the East Ridge. It was still dark when he began his deliveries one misty dawn in 1983. As he turned onto Cherry Street, his headlights cut through the fog and caught something pale by the old quarry gate. A figure, standing motionless, coat heavy with dew. The man's head tilted toward the truck as if watching, though no eyes could be seen behind that white mask. Tom stopped, heart thudding, and called out, "You all right there?" The figure didn't answer. Instead, it lifted one hand, slow, deliberate, and pointed toward the cemetery. Then it stepped backward, fading into the mist like it had never been there at all. When Tom arrived home that evening, his wife found him sitting in the kitchen, silent, staring at nothing. He told her what happened only once, then never again. He retired the next spring. By then, the police had stopped taking new reports. There was no evidence to collect, no suspect to question, no crime to solve. Still, the sightings continued, always in October, always near the cemetery or the quarry, always at night. It was as if the town itself had invited something in, something that thrived on being seen, but never caught. And with each passing year, the story twisted itself tighter into Mineral Point's identity, like ivy creeping along a forgotten wall. Reporters from Madison came to investigate. They spoke to locals, examined records, even spent a night by the cemetery gates with cameras ready. The footage showed nothing but drifting fog and the sway of bare trees, yet when they played the audio back, there was a faint tapping sound, rhythmic, distant, like footsteps echoing through hollow ground. They never aired the piece. By 1985, Halloween in Mineral Point was quieter than ever. Children still dressed up, but the laughter had changed. Softer, cautious. Parents followed close behind, eyes darting to the corners of their streets. Every so often, someone would find a white mask laid somewhere unexpected, on a porch step, hanging from a fence post, tucked into the crook of a tree. Always clean, always expressionless, always gone by morning. For many, the masks became symbols of something unspoken, the way fear could take shape from emptiness, the way people could fill the unknown with their own reflection. A teacher once said in class, "Perhaps the phantom was never real. Perhaps he was just us, looking back at ourselves when the nights grew too long." But when she said it, she noticed the window beside her desk was slightly open, though she hadn't touched it. On the sill rested a single white feather, damp with dew. She closed the window and finished the lesson. Soon, the town learned to live with the story. They folded it into their festivals, their postcards, their identity. Ghost tours began, quietly at first, then more openly. The cemetery became a landmark, the legend a kind of strange pride. But for the older residents, the ones who still remembered the first sightings, it wasn't amusement. It was reverence. The way one might speak of a storm that once came through and never quite left. Margaret Vale, the former shopkeeper, was interviewed years later for a local history project. Her voice, aged and thin, trembled slightly as she spoke. "It wasn't about what he was," she said. "It was about what he reminded us of. That sometimes what we bury isn't gone. It just waits for the right season to walk again." She smiled faintly, as if at some private memory. "And October," she added, "has always been that season." Outside her window, the leaves stirred, though the air was still. By the late 1990s, the story of the Mineral Point Phantom had become something between folklore and warning. Teenagers dared each other to walk the cemetery path after midnight, laughing too loudly to hide their nerves. Tourists came with cameras, hoping to catch a glimpse of something that half the town no longer wanted to see. But for the locals, especially the older ones, October still carried a kind of stillness. They would say, "Don't whistle after dark, don't go near the quarry when the fog rolls in, and if you see a mask, don't touch it." Then came the October of 1998. Cold arrived early that year. A young reporter named Daniel Keene came from Milwaukee, chasing the old legend for a Halloween feature. He was ambitious, the kind who thought that every mystery just needed a rational explanation. "I'll find the man behind the mask," he told the bartender on his first night in town. "Every story starts somewhere, right?" The bartender didn't answer. He just nodded toward the cemetery hill. "Some stories don't start," he said. "They wait." That night, Daniel parked near the old quarry. The fog was thick, a white ocean swallowing the trees. His recorder clicked on. "October 28th, 11:42 p.m., his voice said. "No sign of anyone yet. Visibility's low. Locals say this is where it began." He walked for 15 minutes, following the faint path that led toward the graveyard gate. Then, on the tape, there's a pause, a rustle, the crunch of gravel. "Wait! Someone's here!" Silence. Then, slow, uneven breathing. "It's a mask. Just lying here. White porcelain, no footprints around it." Another pause. "There's something," and then a sound. Tap, tap, tap. Like shoes on wet stone, approaching. The tape cuts there. Daniel's car was found the next morning, door open, headlights still on. His camera lay on the front seat. The film showed nothing but mist, except the last frame, a faint silhouette by the cemetery gate, head tilted slightly as if watching. Daniel was never found. The town didn't speak much about it. The police called it a disappearance, not a haunting. The paper ran one short article, "Journalist missing near Mineral Point Cemetery." And that was that. But every October after, locals began to notice something new. Not a man, not a mask, a light, a dim lantern glow near the quarry, moving slowly, just after midnight. Too steady to be a reflection, too soft to be a flashlight. Some said it was Daniel, still searching for his story. Others said it was the phantom, showing what happens when you look too closely at what wants to be left alone. Now, decades later, the legend endures. Every October, people still visit Mineral Point, some for thrill, some for belief, most for the mystery. They walk the cemetery path, recorders in hand, calling into the fog. And sometimes, if the night is quiet enough, a faint tap, tap, tap answers back. No one ever sees where it comes from. Only the masks appear again, one or two, left by dawn, clean, expressionless, waiting. Because in Mineral Point, they say the story never ended. It simply learned to hide its face. In the fall of 2023, long after the last printed article had yellowed into memory, a quiet voice returned the legend to life. Her name was Clara Vance, a YouTuber known for her midnight documentaries, real stories told in the soft hush of candlelight. Her videos weren't meant to frighten, they were meant to linger. When she first read about Mineral Point, she thought it was folklore, a Halloween myth that had stretched too far. But then she found Daniel Keene's name in an old police database. Missing. No trace. No closure. And beside his report, one single image attachment, a still from his last roll of film. She looked closer. In the fog, a figure, yes, but also something stranger. Near the gate, half buried in frost, was another face. A porcelain mask, cracked at the edge, with what looked like a single letter scratched into the surface. A C. She didn't sleep much after that. Weeks later, she arrived in Mineral Point carrying her small camera and a soft resolve. The town had changed, new shops, brighter lights, but the fog was the same. It rolled through the streets like an old soul that refused to leave. Locals smiled politely when she mentioned the legend, then grew quiet when she said Daniel's name. That night, she filmed her introduction near the quarry, whispering into the camera. Every story leaves an echo. Some are too faint to hear. But tonight, we're listening. Her voice trembled slightly, but her eyes didn't waver. The lantern she carried burned low, a fragile circle of warmth in the dark. Hours passed. The tape shows her walking, calling softly into the mist, her breath catching the cold air. Then she finds it, lying near a stone bench untouched by dew. A white mask, clean, silent, waiting. She kneels, lifting it gently. On the inside, carved shallowly into the porcelain, were two letters this time. CK. She freezes. Her camera catches the faint movement of her hand, trembling. Then a whisper. CK. Clara Keene. Daniel Keene. The wind stirs behind her. The lantern flickers. The camera jerks, turns, and in the distance, there, faint but steady, a glow moves through the fog. A lantern light, slow and rhythmic, drifting between the tombstones. Hello? She calls. No answer. The light stops. Then it bends slightly as if whoever holds it has tilted their head, just like in the photograph. The last few seconds of the video are silent. Only the sound of wind and a faint tap, tap, tap that grows softer, then fades completely. Her channel posted that video automatically the next morning. Scheduled upload, The Phantom of Mineral Point. It reached over 2 million views in 2 days. The comment section filled with disbelief, fascination, and a quiet thread of fear. Clara was never heard from again. When the police searched the quarry path, they found her camera, battery drained, still recording static. Nearby, resting on the stone bench where she had first found it, lay a third mask. The letters inside this one were simple. K. Just that. Locals don't talk about it anymore. They say the story has closed its circle, that the echo has finally gone quiet. But sometimes, on windless nights, travelers driving through Mineral Point glance toward the cemetery and swear they see a faint glow, moving slowly, endlessly in the fog. Not a haunting, not a man. Just the story, still walking. And if you ever go there, if you ever find yourself near that old quarry under a full October moon, don't pick up what you find on the ground. Because the story remembers names now, and it always finishes what it begins. And so, as the night deepened, the echo of Mineral Point faded softly into legend. There is a small town tucked beneath the folds of Kentucky hills, a place most maps forget, where the stars still burn bright enough to touch. Its name is Hollow Creek, and for nearly a century it has carried a sound that no one can explain. Every year, as October draws its last breath, the bells of St. Ilda's Church ring out through the night. 12 deep tolls, slow, steady, mournful. No one pulls the ropes, because there are no ropes left to pull. St. Ilda's stands at the edge of town like a monument to memory. The paint has long peeled away, the doors hang uneven, and ivy has claimed what time forgot. The bell tower itself leans just slightly, as if listening to the valley below. And yet, every Halloween at midnight, when the wind stills and the town sleeps, the bells wake again, their sound drifting through the hills like the heartbeat of something that should no longer live. The story of the bells began long before the church was abandoned. In 1903, Hollow Creek was thriving. Coal trains ran through the valley, the fields were gold with corn, and every Sunday the church was full. The man who tended the tower was Father Amos Hale, tall, soft-spoken, and beloved by all. They said he had the gentlest voice in the county, but when he spoke from the pulpit, the church itself seemed to listen. But that year brought a fever that changed everything. It began in the mines, a sickness without name or cure. Men came home coughing, eyes dimmed, breath shallow. Within weeks, the town fell silent. Graves filled faster than bells could toll. Father Hale buried each soul himself, whispering a prayer for every name he carved. But one night, when his own sister fell ill, he locked himself inside the church and rang the bell for hours, toll after toll, until his hands bled. By morning, the fever had taken her. The people of Hollow Creek found him kneeling beneath the bell rope, his palms torn open, his head bowed. He whispered to no one, "The bells should rest now." And that night, the sound stopped. For years, the tower stood quiet, a hollow shadow above the town, until 1911. On the night of October 31st, a storm swept through the valley, fierce, violent, almost biblical. Lightning split the sky, and the old church caught fire. The townsfolk ran to save what they could, but by the time the rain came, the roof had collapsed. Only the bell tower remained, blackened but standing. And as they watched the flames die down, the bells began to ring. Slowly, deliberately. 12 tolls, the same as the night Father Hale had lost his sister. When morning came, they found the bell ropes burned clean through. No way for anyone to have rung them. But the sound had been real. Everyone heard it. Since then, every Halloween at midnight, the bells return. No storm, no season, no silence has ever stopped them. The locals call it the morning hour. Children hide beneath blankets, dogs whimper, and somewhere between the hills, 12 notes echo through the valley, soft and heavy, as if mourning something too old to name. Some say it's the wind in the iron. Others say it's Father Hale himself, still tolling for those he could not save. But those who've climbed the tower say something else entirely. They say that inside the tower, beneath the soot and time, there are handprints, hundreds of them, pressed deep into the wood, too small, too many to belong to one man, as if the dead themselves were helping him ring. and on one of the beams, carved faintly, almost erased by age, are 5 words: "The bells will not rest." Autumn came early that year, the kind that paints the hills in fading gold and smells faintly of smoke and rain. The people of Hollow Creek had already started covering their chimneys, stacking wood, and closing their windows before dark. But for Dr. Ellis Carter, the quiet arrival of October meant something else entirely, a journey long postponed. Ellis was a historian from Lexington, a man who preferred paper to people and silence to company. His specialty was acoustic anomalies in American architecture. Churches whose bells rang without pull, organs that played without hands, echoes that outlasted time. For years he had heard whispers of St. Ilda's, but only as rumor, a local legend, another ghost story the world had already forgotten. Until one night, he found something buried in an archive at the university library, a journal, brittle and water-stained, signed A. Hale, 1903. The pages were faint, but one line caught him like a whisper. "When the 12th bell tolls, the names will rise." He packed a single bag and drove west into the hills. The road narrowed as the city fell away, twisting through woods so dense the light seemed to breathe. By the time he reached Hollow Creek, the sun had already dipped behind the ridge. The town looked half asleep, its windows glowing like soft embers in the dark. The innkeeper, an old woman with clouded eyes, watched him sign the ledger and said quietly, "You're a day early." "For what?" he asked. Her pen paused. "For the bells." That night, sleep would not come easily. The rain began around midnight, tapping gently against the window, then harder, as if reminding him of something old and urgent. Somewhere beyond the hills, a faint sound rose and fell, slow and deep. The wind carried it like a secret. He tried to convince himself it was thunder. But thunder doesn't count. 12 times. The next morning, he found St. Ilda's. The church stood exactly as the photographs had shown, leaning slightly, its tower a dark silhouette against the pale sky. Up close, the air smelled of rust and wet leaves. The great oak doors gave a reluctant sigh as he pushed them open. Inside, the pews were warped, the pulpit cracked, but the light through the broken windows fell in long golden stripes that made the dust look almost alive. Then he saw them, the handprints. Hundreds, just as the stories had said. Small, childlike impressions blackened into the wood. They climbed the walls in a pattern that seemed deliberate, almost musical, as if placed to echo the rhythm of the bells themselves. He reached out to touch one, but the wood was cold, unnaturally cold, as though something beneath the surface still waited to move. He set up his recorder and camera, adjusting the tripod carefully. "October 30th, his voice said on the tape. "Investigation begins." No signs of tampering. The ropes are gone, but the bell remains intact, mechanically impossible for it to ring without human force. He trailed off. A sudden gust stirred the tower, and from somewhere high above came a faint metallic vibration, not a full toll, just a single, trembling note. He climbed the spiral stairs, one slow step at a time. The wood moaned beneath his weight, dust falling in thin streams. The higher he went, the colder it grew. Near the top, he saw it. The great iron bell, blackened but whole, its mouth facing the open air. The rope beneath it ended in a clean burn, and yet it swayed, barely, gently, as though touched by something unseen. Ellis froze. Then a whisper, faint, hollow, and coming from nowhere, or everywhere. "Names must rise." He stumbled back, nearly losing his footing. His flashlight flickered once, then steadied. No one was there, only the echo of his own breath. But when he returned to the nave below, something had changed. The dust across the floor was disturbed. Small, uneven impressions that hadn't been there before. Dozens of them. Little prints, side by side, leading to the doorway. He followed them outside into the light. They ended just beyond the church steps, disappearing into the grass. That night, back at the inn, Ellis listened to his recording again. The tape hissed and popped with static, but between the sounds of his own movements, there was another voice, low, steady, rhythmic, almost synchronized. Not words, exactly. Just breathing. Dozens of them. And beneath that breath, a faint, rhythmic creak, metal against air, beginning to swing. The bells were already waking, and as the first toll rolled through Hollow Creek that night, the entire town stirred in their sleep. The clock struck midnight, 12 times. And though Ellis tried to convince himself it was just the wind, deep down, he knew something else. The ringing was not random. It followed a pattern, the same as before, the same as 1911. And if the records were right, the same as every 100 years before that. Which meant, if he was right, when the next toll came, it would be for someone living, someone who had already heard the whisper. The morning broke like pale glass, quiet, colorless, the kind of dawn that feels half asleep. The rain had passed, leaving Hollow Creek washed and still. Ellis Carter sat at the window of his inn room, a cup of untouched coffee cooling beside his notes. He hadn't slept. Not really. The tape recorder still lay on the desk, its reels frozen mid-turn, as if unwilling to replay what it had caught. He opened Father Hale's journal again. The pages smelled faintly of smoke and cedar, edges browned like autumn leaves. The handwriting was fine and deliberate, the ink faded but steady. He had read it a dozen times already, but this morning a new shadow of meaning began to form, one he hadn't noticed before. On a page dated October 31st, 1903, Father Hale had written, "The sound is not mine alone. It rises from below. The 13th waits, though none must hear it." Ellis frowned. There were 12 bells, always 12, one for each toll, one for each soul, the town had said. But here was Hale speaking of a 13th, a bell that waited, unheard. He turned the page and something slipped loose, a folded sheet, brittle and sealed at one edge with the residue of wax. He opened it carefully. It wasn't a letter. It was a map, a rough sketch of Hollow Creek as it had once been, before the rail line, before the new cemetery. The lines were uneven, hand-drawn, but clear enough to read. There, in the center, marked with a small black circle, was St. Ilda's Church. Beneath it, faint words written in Latin, Sub terra campana dormit. He translated softly under his breath. Beneath the ground, the bell sleeps. Something stirred behind his ribs. Not fear exactly, but a cold, hollow recognition, like a door opening in a dream. He packed his bag, slung his lantern over his shoulder, and drove back to the church. The morning mist clung low over the valley. The grass shone wet, and the tower loomed above like a skeleton of iron. Inside, the air was thick with damp earth and age. He made his way behind the altar to where the stone floor cracked slightly along one seam. The marks there weren't random. They formed a half-circle, a boundary, a lid. Ellis knelt, brushed away the moss, and felt the faint hollow beneath his hand. There was space below. He set his lantern beside him, used the iron handle of his flashlight to wedge between the stones, and pulled. The slab gave a slow groan, a breath of cool air rising from the dark beneath. The smell that followed was old. Soil and iron and something faintly sweet, like long-faded incense. A staircase descended, narrow and uneven. He took a breath and started down. Each step creaked softly underfoot. The walls were close, carved earth and brick, damp with condensation. The air grew heavier as he descended, filled with a low hum, barely perceptible, but constant. At the bottom, the passage opened into a small crypt, circular, perfectly symmetrical. The light from his lantern reached only so far, but in its glow, he could make out 12 niches carved into the walls. Inside each lay a bell, small, tarnished, and silent. And in the center of the floor, a hollow, a missing place, the 13th. As he stepped closer, the hum deepened. He knelt, brushing away the dust, and saw something buried shallowly beneath the dirt, an outline of iron, half exposed, half swallowed by time. He reached out and stopped. The metal was warm. For a moment, the air seemed to pulse. The lantern flame trembled. Somewhere above, faintly, impossibly, he heard it. The church bell moving, slow and deliberate, though no wind stirred. The hum rose into a tone, a single note, deep and sorrowful, vibrating through the stone. The 12 smaller bells along the wall trembled in response, each giving a faint answering ring. Then silence, and in that silence, he heard something else. Whispering. Soft, layered, countless voices murmuring the same words, too faint to understand, too many to count. They rose and fell like waves, circling him. He tried to move, but his legs felt heavy, the air thick. His recorder clicked on in his pocket, capturing nothing but static and breathing. He whispered to himself, This isn't sound. Because he realized, suddenly, the hum wasn't coming from the bells. It was coming from beneath them. The ground itself was singing. He fled. Up the steps, through the cracked stone, out into the gray daylight. His breath came sharp, the cold morning air slicing through the damp chill that clung to him. When he reached his car, the church loomed silent behind him, still as if nothing had moved at all. That night, back at the inn, he tried to write, to make sense of what he'd found. His notes scattered across the desk, the journal open to the map, the tape still recording the empty room. And then, as the clock turned toward midnight, the bells began again. 12 tolls. But the 12th didn't stop. A pause, long enough for a heartbeat. Then, a 13th, low, hollow, heavier than all the rest. It rolled through the valley, shaking the glass in the windows. The old woman at the inn crossed herself, whispering a prayer. Ellis sat frozen, every nerve alive, because he knew that sound had come from below, not above. The 13th bell had woken, and in that moment, every clock in Hollow Creek stopped. Not for long, only a few seconds, but just long enough for the world to take a breath. Then everything resumed as if nothing had changed. Except Ellis. Because he knew what he had felt beneath his hand in the crypt. It hadn't been a bell. Not truly. The metal had curved, yes, but it was ribbed, hollowed differently. More like a casing, a seal, something buried, not to remember, but to contain. And now, it had stirred. The next morning felt unreal, the kind of silence that hangs after something ancient has stirred. Hollow Creek looked the same, but the air carried an unease, as if the hills themselves were holding their breath. Ellis Carter hadn't slept again. His notebook was filled with sketches, names, fragments of thoughts written in a shaking hand. He could still hear that 13th toll in his bones. At breakfast, the innkeeper brought him coffee and said nothing. Her eyes lingered a moment too long before she whispered, "You should leave before dark, Dr. Carter. You've heard what you needed." But he hadn't. Not yet. He left for the church one last time, though he told himself it was only to collect his equipment. The road was slick from last night's rain, the trees bending slightly in a slow, breathless wind. When St. Ilda's appeared through the fog, its outline looked softer, almost translucent, as if the building were remembering itself in pieces. Inside, the air was heavier than before. The scent of iron hung thicker, mingled with something sweet and earthy. He set his lantern down near the altar and looked again at the crack in the floor where he had descended. It was still open, a dark mouth waiting. He hesitated, then stepped down again. The crypt was colder now, but brighter, the air faintly aglow as though light came from the stones themselves. Dust motes floated like tiny ghosts in the air. He approached the place where he had unearthed the outline of the buried shape. This time, he brought a brush, gently sweeping away the soil. Inch by inch, the surface beneath revealed itself. Not a bell after all, but something older, more deliberate. A slab of dark metal, engraved with rings of symbols, none of which matched any alphabet he knew. In the center, faint but legible, was a single name, Amara Hale. His throat tightened, the name from the journal, Father Hale's sister, the one lost to the fever. He flipped open the old journal again. Near the final page, he found an entry written in a hurried, broken scrawl. She would not lie still. The fever left her hollow, not gone. I rang the 12 for mercy, but the 13th was for silence. Forgive me, Ellis read the line twice, his heart pounding in his ears. She would not lie still. The words seemed to echo in the stone chamber, soft but certain. He realized slowly what Hale had done. The bells were not just symbols of mourning, they were seals, each toll binding what the 13th contained, 12 layers of sound holding one name quiet. Amara Hale hadn't been buried in the church. She had been buried beneath it. And the 13th bell was not meant to call the dead. It was meant to keep one from answering. The hum began again, faint at first, then rising like a slow breath. The 12 smaller bells trembled in their alcoves, answering some unseen signal. The ground beneath him pulsed, once, twice, steady as a heartbeat. He stepped back. The soil near the slab shifted, almost imperceptibly. A fissure spread along one edge, exhaling a cold draft that smelled faintly of lavender and ash. Then he heard it. A voice. Soft, female. Close. Father? The sound wasn't loud. It wasn't cruel. It was small, trembling, almost tender, but it came from beneath the slab. Ellis froze. Every rational thought screamed to run, to leave the church and never return. But curiosity, that terrible, fragile human instinct, rooted him where he stood. You rang for me, the voice whispered. You never let me sleep. The lantern light dimmed. The air thickened until it pressed against his skin. He stumbled backward, fumbling for his recorder, though he knew it couldn't capture this. The air itself had turned to sound, then a sound from above. The bells, 1, 2, 3, each toll a vibration through his bones. He could feel the resonance climbing from the ground to the tower. The air pulsed with rhythm, not chaotic, but measured, like a ritual long remembered. He looked down. The slab glowed faintly along its carved edges. The symbols burned with pale light, and the 13th toll came, long, deep, and final. The light vanished. The air stilled. Then silence. For a full minute, nothing. Then faintly, from below the stone, a single, almost inaudible breath. Free. The word rippled through the chamber and died. Ellis bolted up the steps into the open air, gasping. The sky above Hollow Creek had changed, not darker, but heavier, as though the clouds had lowered themselves closer to listen. The wind carried a sound. Not bells this time, but something gentler, like the sigh of a child. He looked back once toward the church. The tower stood straight now. The tilt it had carried for a century was gone. The wood and brick looked cleaner somehow, as if time had been quietly undone, and though the doors were open, no one could see inside. Just darkness, deep and still. He left Hollow Creek that night, driving until the hills disappeared behind him. But every few miles, through the hum of the tires and the whisper of the wind, he could swear he heard it, faint and rhythmic. Not 12, not even 13. Just one bell, ringing softly, endlessly, somewhere far behind him. London, 1893. Fog like wet wool pressed against the gas lamps, turning every glow into a blurred halo. Along Fleet Street, the night was busy with carriages. Yet somewhere between the noise of hooves and the hiss of steam, one studio window stayed perfectly still, its curtains drawn, its candle burning too long into the dark. Inside, a man sat motionless before a canvas. His name was Edmund Vale, portraitist to the upper class, a painter known for capturing the truth in his subjects, though no one could ever say what that meant. His works were famous for their eyes. People swore they seemed to move when you looked away, like a breath had passed just behind the glass. But Vale hadn't painted for months, not since the death of his daughter, Lydia. She had been 12, soft-spoken, fascinated by his paints, always leaving fingerprints on his brushes. Pneumonia took her in the winter, and though the doctor said she went peacefully, Edmund couldn't believe peace could be so quiet. Her laughter had stopped, but her presence clung to the walls like the smell of turpentine and lavender oil. For weeks after her funeral, he didn't leave the house. Neighbors spoke in hushed tones about the candlelight flickering in the attic window. Some nights, they claimed they could hear a child's hum, faint and melodic, even though the house was empty except for him. Then, one evening in March, he appeared at the art supply shop, pale, eyes red, carrying a list of pigments so specific the clerk had to check twice. Among them was one that didn't exist in any record. Ethereal white number. 13. When asked where he'd heard of it, Edmund only said, it was her favorite color. He began painting again. The portrait was meant to be Lydia's final likeness. A memory, he said, to keep her with him always. But what emerged on the canvas wasn't the delicate innocence of a lost child. It was something else, something alive. Her eyes were wrong, not cruel, not sad, just aware. The shade of blue seemed to follow the viewer wherever they moved. Her skin carried the faintest warmth, like sunlight trapped beneath glass. Weeks passed. The portrait grew stranger. When visitors came, fellow painters, friends, the occasional art critic, they would find Vale sitting in front of the painting, whispering as if to someone just beyond the frame. Some swore they heard a second voice answering, quiet, high-pitched, rhythmic, like a lullaby being hummed from another room. He began sealing the studio every night, claiming that drafts disturbed the varnish. But neighbors noticed the window fogging from the inside, as if two people were breathing there instead of one. Then came October. On the 31st, Vale sent invitations to a handful of patrons, titled Men and Their Wives, all eager to see his final and most intimate work. The note ended simply, "Come before midnight." She loves the hour. The guests arrived to find the studio draped in velvet, lit only by candlelight. In the center stood the painting, tall and framed in black oak. Lydia's likeness seemed to glow softly, her pale dress shimmering as though made of mist. Edmund greeted them with an unnerving calm. He looked thinner, older, but his eyes shone with feverish devotion. "She's here tonight," he said almost joyfully. "She wanted to see you all." The guests smiled politely, until one of them, Lady Winterbourne, stepped close and gasped. "Good heavens, she's breathing." The others laughed nervously, but when they leaned in, they saw it too, a faint rise and fall beneath the painted chest, so slow it could have been imagination. Yet the candle flame flickered each time, as though responding to the rhythm. Vale stood beside the frame, his hand resting gently on the glass. "Do you see?" he whispered. "She only wakes on All Hallows' Eve. Because love is a kind of resurrection." The clock struck 12. The air changed, colder, sharper. The guests felt it move through them like a sudden exhale. One of the candles went out, then another. The portrait's eyes shifted, just slightly, enough to catch the edge of the light. Someone screamed. When the final candle extinguished, there was only darkness. and a sound, soft but distinct, the sound of glass cracking. By morning, the studio was sealed by police. No sign of the guests remained, only their overturned chairs and broken goblets. Edmund Vale was found kneeling before the portrait, smiling faintly, one hand pressed flat against the surface. The painting itself was untouched, except for one change. Where Lydia's eyes had been, the paint was gone. Two perfect holes stared through the canvas, clean and dark, and on the back, written in wet varnish, were the words, "She didn't like being alone." The portrait of Lydia Vale vanished from the records after that night. No one knew who took it or how it escaped the sealed room. For more than a century, it was little more than a whispered legend among curators, a cursed painting, a ghost story tucked between footnotes of the Victorian art scene. But time, as it always does, found a way to wake the past again. In 2009, a collector named Henry Corbin bought an estate on the outskirts of Bath, an ivy-covered mansion filled with forgotten trunks, portraits, and relics of old English families. Henry wasn't a man of superstition. He was a historian of art, a lover of details, someone who spent more time talking to old frames than to people. He believed every piece of art carried a breath of the one who made it, not a haunting, just a memory that refused to fade. When he found the painting, it was hidden behind a wall panel, its surface wrapped in yellowed cloth. A faint scent of turpentine still clung to it. He unwrapped it slowly, and the dust rose like breath. Beneath, the girl's face emerged, pale as the moon, eyes blue and bright and impossibly young. The canvas had aged, but she hadn't. Henry smiled. "You've waited a long time," he murmured. He hung her in his private gallery, above the marble fireplace, beneath the watch of a glass-dome skylight. That night he wrote in his journal, "Her presence fills the room. It feels lighter, almost kind." The first week passed quietly, but on the 8th night, Henry noticed something. Her gaze. It seemed different each morning. Sometimes she looked slightly to the left, sometimes her chin lifted as though she were listening. He laughed it off, blaming exhaustion. But the next night, he woke at 3:12 a.m. to the sound of a faint hum, a child's hum, soft, rhythmic, the kind of tune a girl might sing to herself while painting beside her father. He followed the sound to the gallery. The air was still, but the painting shimmered faintly, as if touched by candlelight, though none burned. The hum stopped when he entered, and for a heartbeat, the glass before the painting fogged, as if someone had exhaled on the other side. Henry stood there, breath shallow. "Lydia," he whispered, half in jest, "is that you?" Nothing, just silence. But when he turned away, he thought he heard a small giggle, light, distant, fading. The next day he called a conservator, Eleanor Shaw, a specialist in 19th century oils. She was young, methodical, and firmly practical. When she arrived, she examined the painting with care, tracing every stroke. "There's something strange here," she said quietly. "The eyes, they aren't pigment. They're enamel, fused glass, melted into the paint. It shouldn't have survived the century." Henry frowned. "Could that make it reflective?" Eleanor nodded. "Reflective, yes, but not like this. It's almost translucent." They both leaned closer. Within the blue of the eyes, beneath the varnish, there seemed to be motion. Not a reflection, not a trick of light, but something deeper, like water beneath ice. That night, they left the room sealed, but when Eleanor returned the next morning, she found something on the floor. A single white fingerprint, faint and small, pressed into the varnish of the protective glass. A child's print. She said nothing, neither did Henry. But that evening, they installed a camera. At 11:58 p.m., the lens caught movement, subtle at first. The candle flame on the mantel flickered without wind. The portrait brightened slightly, as if lit from within, and then, at midnight, the painting breathed. The chest rose, the glass fogged. A handprint appeared, pressing gently against the inside of the frame. 12 slow breaths, then stillness. The camera shut off at 12:13, static replacing the image. In the morning, Henry watched the footage 3 times. He didn't show Eleanor. He didn't tell anyone. Instead, he wrote one last entry in his journal. Her presence fills the room. It feels lighter, almost kind. The first week passed quietly, but on the 8th night, Henry noticed something, her gaze. It seemed different each morning. Sometimes she looked slightly to the left, sometimes her chin lifted as though she were listening. He laughed it off, blaming exhaustion. But the next night, he woke at 3:12 a.m. to the sound of a faint hum, a child's hum, soft, rhythmic, the kind of tune a girl might sing to herself while painting beside her father. He followed the sound to the gallery. The air was still, but the painting shimmered faintly, as if touched by candlelight, though none burned. The hum stopped when he entered, and for a heartbeat, the glass before the painting fogged, as if someone had exhaled on the other side. Henry stood there, breath shallow. "Lydia," he whispered, half in jest. "Is that you?" Nothing, just silence. But when he turned away, he thought he heard a small giggle, light, distant, fading. The next day, he called a conservator, Eleanor Shaw, a specialist in 19th century oils. She was young, methodical, and firmly practical. When she arrived, she examined the painting with care, tracing every stroke. "There's something strange here," she said quietly. "The eyes. They aren't pigment. They're enamel. Fused glass. Melted into the paint. It shouldn't have survived the century." Henry frowned. "Could that make it reflective?" Eleanor nodded. "Reflective, yes, but not like this. It's almost translucent." They both leaned closer. Within the blue of the eyes, beneath the varnish, there seemed to be motion, not a reflection, not a trick of light, but something deeper, like water beneath ice. That night they left the room sealed, but when Eleanor returned the next morning, she found something on the floor. A single white fingerprint, faint and small, pressed into the varnish of the protective glass. A child's print. She said nothing. Neither did Henry. But that evening they installed a camera. At 11:58 p.m., the lens caught movement, subtle at first. The candle flame on the mantel flickered without wind. The portrait brightened slightly, as if lit from within. And then, at midnight, the painting breathed. The chest rose. The glass fogged. A handprint appeared, pressing gently against the inside of the frame. 12 slow breaths, then stillness. The camera shut off at 12:13, static replacing the image. In the morning, Henry watched the footage 3 times. He didn't show Eleanor. He didn't tell anyone. Instead, he wrote one last entry in his journal. "It's not haunting. It's longing. She wakes because she remembers. She looks through because she wants to be seen." That night, he stayed in the gallery, a single candle burning beside him. The next morning, the housekeeper found the room cold as stone. Henry's chair was empty. The candle had burned down to wax tears, and the painting had changed. Lydia Vale still stood where she always had, but now she was not alone. A faint silhouette stood behind her, the outline of a man, his face half-formed, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. The brushwork was unmistakable. It was Edmund Vale's own. And in the corner of the frame, fresh and wet despite a century of age, a new line had appeared. "Together at last." The desert at night is a quiet thing, too quiet. The stars hang motionless above the black stretch of Highway 94, and the road hums softly beneath the wind like a tired machine. Out here, between San Diego and nowhere, there's a place that doesn't show up on most maps anymore. A pale, crumbling building with a flickering neon sign that reads only, vacancy. The rest of the word has long since burned out. They call it the Sunset Motel, a name that once sounded inviting when travelers still passed this way. Back in the 1960s, the highway was a living artery of summer families and long-haul truckers. But then the new interstate opened, and the world forgot this stretch existed. The motel should have died then, too. But it didn't, because people still stopped there, the kind who were running from something, and not all of them ever left. The first story came in 1971 from a police officer named Carl Henley. He'd been responding to a report of strange noises from the motel, a low humming sound that neighbors said echoed across the desert for hours. When Henley arrived, the front office was lit, though no car sat in the lot. Inside, the desk bell still gleamed, the key rack hung neatly, but the register book was open to a blank page. He called out. No answer, only the hum, soft, steady, coming from room 6. The door was unlocked. The lights were off, but the air smelled faintly of ozone, like the air after lightning. The curtains were drawn tight, the window nailed shut. And on the bed lay a suitcase, perfectly packed, clothes folded, toothbrush still dry. The room was spotless, except for one thing. On the bathroom mirror, someone had written with their fingertip through the dust. Checked in. No one was ever found. No fingerprints. No signs of struggle. Henley quit the force 2 months later. He refused to talk about that night again. The motel went through new owners, each one lasting less than a year. One claimed the rooms whispered at night. Another said the clocks never kept time. They'd stop at 12:03 every night, then resume at dawn. Travelers who stayed the night often woke with the same dream, walking down an endless hallway, lined with identical doors, each marked with the same number, 6. In 1989, a drifter named Marianne Loft checked in. She was 26, hitchhiking west to Los Angeles. She signed the register in neat handwriting, her name, the date, one night only. The clerk remembered her smile. The next morning, her car was still parked outside. The door to her room was locked from the inside. Her suitcase stood open on the floor, untouched. But Marianne was gone. The only thing she left behind was a Polaroid on the nightstand, one that no one remembered taking. It showed the empty motel room, lit by the lamp, the bed perfectly made. But in the reflection of the window, barely visible, was the outline of a woman, standing outside, staring in. The police logged it, sealed the room, and boarded it up. The motel finally closed. For 20 years, the Sunset Motel sat beneath the desert sun, fading into silence. The sand piled against the doors. The sign flickered its half-lit word into the dark. But every Halloween, truckers swore they saw the place glowing again, the vacancy sign burning bright red for just one night. And sometimes they said, if you slowed down and rolled your window low, you could hear it. The hum. Faint, metallic, rhythmic, like the sound of something turning on from far away. In 2018, a group of urban explorers found the motel again. Half buried in sand, doors splintered, the office still standing. They streamed their visit live, laughing as they went room to room. Everything was dust and emptiness, until one of them, a man named Jonah, pushed open the door marked 6. It opened easily. The room was clean. The bed was made. A single bulb still glowed overhead, humming softly. On the nightstand sat the old register book, open to a new page. Fresh ink. One line. Jonah H. checked in. The camera went dark. Police later found their abandoned van 2 miles away, engine still running. The footage uploaded to their channel never stopped recording. 11 hours of static, broken only once at 12:03 a.m. when the words appeared faintly across the black screen. Checked out. The desert doesn't forgive, but it remembers. That's what Officer Carl Henley thought when he stood once more before the crumbling shell of the Sunset Motel, 50 years after the first time he'd seen it. He was 79 now, slower, quieter, but still haunted by the hum that had never left his dreams. He told himself this visit was only for peace. Closure, maybe. But deep down, he knew the truth. You don't come back to the desert unless something out here is still calling your name. The highway was silent except for the faint tremor of wind. The sign, that cursed blinking vacancy, still worked. No power lines led to it. It glowed anyway, a pulse in the dark. Carl parked his truck, the headlights sweeping across the old reception office. Inside, dust hung like fog. The register was still there, waiting. Its pages were curled and yellow, but when he turned to the last one, his throat tightened. The ink was fresh. The newest name read, Jonah H. Checked in. Carl closed the book gently. I told them to burn this place down, he whispered. Should have done it myself. He walked toward room 6. The air grew heavier with each step, as though the world itself thickened. The desert wind fell still. The stars dimmed. The door, the one that should have been nailed shut decades ago, was slightly open, waiting. Inside, everything was perfect. The bed was made, the curtains drawn, the lamp on the nightstand burned steady, though the bulb was coated with age. And there, sitting on the table, was something new, a black and white Polaroid. It showed the room exactly as it was now. Except in the photo, there was a man sitting on the bed. His head was bowed, hands folded. Carl felt his own pulse slow. It was him, his younger self. Same uniform, same badge, same lost expression from that night in 1971. He dropped the photo. It landed face down with a soft, papery sigh. He turned toward the door, but the handle was gone. The window, too. Only the mirror remained, tall and clouded, hanging above the dresser. And from its surface, the hum began again, low, metallic, almost like breathing. Carl stared into it, and for a long, suspended moment he thought he saw movement behind the reflection, the faint shape of people. Dozens of them. Men, women, children, all standing quietly in the shadows of the mirror, eyes open, waiting. Some he recognized from old police files, some from faces on missing posters, and one, a young woman, blonde hair, Polaroid camera around her neck, Marianne Loft. Her lips moved slowly, forming words he couldn't hear. Then, all at once, the sound came through. A voice so soft it almost wasn't there. We can't leave until someone takes our place. The lamp flickered. The hum rose to a trembling note that filled the walls, the air, the bones. Carl stumbled back, breath ragged, reaching for the door that no longer existed. But the mirror shimmered now, glass melting into liquid light, and in its surface, the reflections began to move toward him, reaching, stretching, their faces calm, almost kind. He whispered, "No," but the word vanished under the hum, and then silence. The truck was found idling the next morning by a patrolman from the new county line. The door was open, keys still in the ignition, radio playing faint static. No sign of Carl Henley. Inside the motel office, the register lay open. A new entry, written in the same slow, careful handwriting. Carl Henley. Checked in. Room 6. That night, long-haul truckers on Highway 94 said the motel lights were glowing again. Some swore they saw a figure standing outside the office window, an old man in a police jacket, holding a set of keys. And if you drive that road now, past the turnoff where the desert folds into blackness, you might still catch it. A low, steady hum beneath the stars. Not the wind, not the power lines. just the motel, breathing. And somewhere in that endless stillness, a neon sign flickers again to life. Vacancy. And now. The road grows quiet again. The hum fades. The stories fold themselves back into the dark, like whispered secrets drifting through sleep. The motel sleeps, the painter rests, the bells are silent once more. Yet something lingers. Not fear, not even sadness, just remembrance. Because every story you've heard tonight, every flicker of light that refused to go out, carries the same quiet truth. Not everything that disappears is gone. Some things stay behind in echoes, in old walls, in the hush between midnight and morning. And maybe that's not haunting at all. Maybe it's just love. Love that doesn't know how to sleep. If you listen closely, you can almost hear it now. A soft wind brushing past forgotten doors. A bell that rings for no reason. A voice in the paint that still hums the tune of home. These are not the cries of the lost. They are lullabies for those who remain. So close your eyes. Let the world outside grow softer. The ghosts have told their stories. Now they too are at rest. The night has no more to show you, only to hold you gently as the last echoes fade. And if these stories have kept you company beneath the quiet hours, if they've carried you a little closer to sleep, then let this channel stay by your side too, like a candle burning low, whispering softly that you're safe. Good night, traveler. Sleep deeply. The world will still be here when you wake. Older, quieter, and full of stories waiting to be told again.